Hi, I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez.
And this podcast is for graduate teachers in their first 5 years.
We share our own teaching stories as well as advice and ideas we wish we'd had as graduate teachers.
Sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, but always true.
We want you to thrive and love teaching beyond the dreaded 5-year cliff.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm a teacher and I actually can't write straight on the whiteboard.
Hi, I'm Bez, maths and science teacher, and because I'm a lefty, I always smudge my handwriting on the board.
Can't relate.
No. So, Chloe, the last few episodes we've done, it's been about what's happening inside the classroom, but as teachers, there are also a lot of other things that are happening outside of the classroom. So I thought this episode would be a great one if we could talk about parent-teacher interviews and what to expect and how to manage that whole process.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. We've been very teacher and student focused.
We
haven't yet analysed the importance of relationships with parents and guardians.
And it's actually one of the ATSL, I still get it wrong. ATSL standards.
Teaching standards. One of the teaching standards is to make sure that you're engaging with parents and carers.
Yep, and the community as well.
And I think, most obvious is to talk about parent-teacher interviews.
Yes, absolutely. Have you got any stories from parent-teacher interviews?
I mean, I feel like you've always got a story, but I mean, I can speak to so many things, but things that stick out for me is just like remembering how tiring they are. Like that is a big day.
Yeah.
Whether you are doing it for the first time or whether you've done parent-teacher interviews for ages, it's always like a massive day. That's the biggest thing that I remember.
Yeah, it is exhausting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Feels like you've been at work for a whole week.
Oh, you kind of need to block out time to just lock yourself in a dark room and isolate yourself from people for like a very long time after that. But I think it might be nice for us to discuss, well, given it is such a big day, what's the best thing that we should recommend for people to do to prepare, and what should people expect of parent-teacher interviews?
Yeah, I think they're both great starting off points. How do you prepare? Know your students' names. That's a great start.
Great place to start.
In terms of preparation, one suggestion is to always have evidence or pieces of work that you can have conversations with or about as well, rather than just broadly speaking. It's more helpful to have a student's piece of work there.
Something to refer to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's excellent advice. Doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to have piles of work sitting around you, but it might just be, you've got some digital examples of work that you can draw from, or a marking book, or just, a piece of work that you've marked recently with feedback that might be on your school's like learning management system, whatever it is, having something that you can speak directly to, because part of it is really just sharing that feedback directly with the parents. They want to know, okay, well, not only how is my child, or, the person I'm caring for, not only how they behave and engage in class, but they want to know how their social development is going. They also want to know how they're developing intellectually. So it's a little bit broader than just about marks or just about behaviour. Yeah. You kind of need to bring it all together. And I found specifically when it comes to Year 7 students who are going through that primary school to high school transition, those interviews always took a little bit longer because it's such a big milestone for those students.
Yes.
And that the social aspect of things, particularly for the first part of the year, does take up and dominate quite a bit of that, or can dominate a bit of that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the work thing's really important, but I want to come back to something you said before about knowing students' names.
Yes, very important.
I know I have been guilty of having a student sort of stand up and start walking towards my table at interviews, and I've had this like, oh no moment of I can't remember your name because you're out of uniform and you're not sitting in the part of the class that I usually
Yep.
see you in, and that's how I remember who you are, and I don't have the role in front of me, and you kind of blank.
Yeah.
What are some tips and tricks that you can give people to help them? Because like you're going to have moments where you're blank.
Yeah.
How do you remember names?
I always, every single year, didn't matter if it was my first year or my last year that I was teaching, I always had a paper roll with a photo and the name just
Yep.
because I do forget. And then when I panic, I blank.
Brilliant.
Like what you're saying as well. That is just my go-to, to be honest. But I mean, like when you're teaching, there should be a system where you're able to see who's booked you in for what time slots as well.
Yep.
So that's also helpful, having a look on, the learning management system that can give you an indication of who you're going to
Who's
be
next?
speaking to. Yeah.
Yeah. It also helps to keep you on track because interviews are very busy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like, particularly if you're doing them in person, and I know that, you know, throughout lockdowns and things, some schools were doing them online, some schools cancelled them, some schools have kept elements of them to be online. So I don't know, maybe it's worth us having a chat about that, how they differ. But in person, you're often in a room with at least, 3 other teachers?
Yeah.
So there's 4 of you there. Then there's people coming in and out constantly. There's parents. There's obviously students, then sometimes there's siblings, sometimes there's other parents and guardians there. Then you've got like principal staff and people walking around and greeting people and saying hello. Sometimes you might be working with interpreters. It's a very loud, over-stimulating sensory place.
It is. And there's a lot happening there, which is, it links back to what you were talking about before in terms of like, it does drain your energy a lot as well. And there is a lot happening. And, depending on which school you're at, like you mentioned, you were 3 or 4 other staff at a school I was at. We were all in the auditorium.
I've done that too.
We had a timer up. It was like speed dating. I found that hilarious. But, it's a very busy space and you're hearing different conversations. And depending on if you're having students there and interpreters there as well, it's a lot happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the duration of your interview also comes into it. Like you mentioned timing. And the first school that I worked at, our interviews were scheduled to be 3 or 4 minutes. In my opinion, that is so not enough time for you to even scratch the surface of how that student is going and to look at sort of next steps and, different things, set some goals and implement those kinds of things. But I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, have an idea of the kinds of things that you can draw on. I think that's one thing. Knowing your student names and your schedule is another. But keeping to time. So often, if you've only got a couple of minutes, you got to be really strategic about what you're going to speak about. You're not going to be able to speak about everything.
Yep.
And then using those timers or even having your phone with you and setting a little timer and just saying, hey, I'm just going to set a timer just so I can keep to time, both for you so you can make your other interviews, but also for the others that are visiting me here today. That's also going to help you then look at your list, and when you see 5 of your students waiting for you, you can just be calm and be like, okay, all right, maybe I am a couple of minutes behind, but I know who's next.
Yeah.
And just, it's okay to just apologise to the families.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm running a couple of minutes behind. If you need to duck off to another interview and come back, we can make time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious to know, have you ever had any situations where you've had either difficult conversations or you've had perhaps some parents or carers get upset at you? Maybe,
all the time.
Maybe for running over.
Oh, for running over? No. I think what you've mentioned about if the school hasn't got a timer up, it's definitely handy to put a timer on. It's just about respecting everyone's time and making sure that people who've booked in actually are able to see you, because they might only be able to come out of their work for, half an hour and they've just managed to squeeze you in.
People have made the effort to be there.
Yeah. So I haven't had anyone specifically upset at me for timing, but there have been, and I think quite naturally too, because sometimes some conversations, go a bit longer or you get caught up on something. But I have had like parents sort of lingering around. But, most of the time the person that you're talking to will be like, oh, okay. Like my time's up or, and you can sort of mention to the person that you're having the conversation with, look, I'm happy to give you a call or an email and
we can continue
this conversation as well. So it's great that we started it. Let's continue it. That's a really great way to be like happy to keep chatting about it further as well.
Yeah.
I think. What about you?
Yeah. I think in my first couple of years, I definitely had some situations where people would come to visit me who hadn't actually booked in and I felt pressured to make time for them.
Yeah.
And this was a school where we were working with interpreters in 3-minute time slots.
Yeah.
Whenever you have to work with an interpreter, double the amount of time that you need.
That's a good tip.
Or even more because you've got to say something, then it's got to go to the interpreter, they've got to say it back, and it's just this like chain of things. So everything's delayed. It does take a little bit longer to get your point across. And then for you to get that feedback, back to you. But yes, me being people pleaser Chloe, decided that I would just try and fit everybody in, even if they didn't have an appointment, which, yes, was very kind of me, but it also meant that I was then running over. And I did have a parent one year who cracked it.
Oh, no. What did they
They got pretty upset and they were like, oh, this was my appointment time, and they were getting a little bit fussy about things. However, I must add that even though I was running over time, it wasn't quite her appointment time yet. So it wasn't necessarily warranted. So I think in that situation, like I handled it pretty well, I thought, for someone who was a newbie and hadn't done interviews before. And I just apologised and I said, look, I understand it's a very busy night. You've got lots of people to see. This is where I'm up to. This is the time that I have your appointment. Like, I'm definitely going to be seeing you. And, once we get to your appointment time, like, please come on through. Like, thank you so much for your patience.
Yeah.
And then once it was their turn and we'd made their time, like, totally different story. They were fine.
Yeah.
So it was okay in the end. But yeah, like there are situations where you might run over, and I've had a couple of parents be like, oh, a bit disgruntled, like, oh, and I've been like, look, I am really sorry, like full disclosure, I am running a little bit behind. If you do have a line of people and you're running behind, it's okay to just stand up and like just let everyone know.
Yep.
Hey, I'm really sorry, running a little bit behind. If you do have other interviews, like feel free to come back and we'll work it out. Otherwise, here's my details. Please email me. We can schedule a time to chat, like you said before.
Yeah.
And generally they're fine with that.
Yeah. And I think like that's a really important point that you raised. We'll be generalising. I think quite a few teachers are people pleasers. So it can be really difficult to say no or to push back, particularly if you're in your early years of teaching. I know, like same as you, I was a people pleaser. I found that really difficult. And a phrase that I found was really helpful was if a parent or a caregiver hadn't booked in, being like, oh, look, I've got 3 slots free at 5:15. I'm happy for you to come back. And that's a gentle way to sort of be like, look, this is the time slot. Until then, I'm actually quite booked out. So I really have to honour and stick to what people have booked in. But just know it is okay to say no or gently push back as well. You don't have to see everyone. And, that's part of the interview process as well. Parents and caregivers will also pick up that, okay, I do have to book a time in if I would like to speak to the teacher about that as well.
Yeah. For sure.
It's not to say like say no all the time, but
no, I'm not going to engage with you.
No, but there are ways that you can do that gently.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah.
I'd like to circle back, and I do want to come back to maybe some other types of difficult conversations, but let's pause and save that.
Yeah.
Because I thought maybe what we should do is like a bit of a role play of like, okay, well, what does a structure of an interview look like, or what could it look like?
Yeah.
So do you want to be my teacher? And
Sure.
I can act as student and parent at the parent
Student and parent, double.
Yeah. I mean, look, I will just preface for everyone that you will be in situations where maybe you're just speaking with a parent or guardian. Other times you might have the student there too.
Yep.
Really depends.
Yeah.
So what should we
Which
role play
one?
here?
On that note too, depending on the school you're at, did you find that there was a preference with if they wanted the student there or not? Because I found that changed, and also how you manage that, because obviously some conversations that you have, you would like the student to be there because obviously you're talking about them as well.
I had one school where they were like, if you're coming to interviews, like we would like to make it compulsory that the student comes also. And we found that most students did come. Other school, it was like totally like up to their discretion, and we kind of got 50-50.
That's interesting.
So it was really different. I thought that like having the expectation of like students must be there really made a difference.
It does.
What about you?
Yeah. Mine was the same. Like first school I was at, actually no, first school I was at, most students did come, but then slowly we built the culture of, since this is a conversation about the student needs to be there.
Makes sense
it's
for
a
them to be
partnership with the parent or caregiver and the student. And then the second school I was at, that was sort of just preference, but I think most parents and caregivers brought their child along. But, if you do get an interview where the student doesn't come along and you really wanted them to as well, something you can say to the parent is like, oh, I'd really love for Sally to join next time. I think it's important, given that this conversation is about Sally as well. So if you're able to bring her next time, and that sort of sets the expectation as well. I feel like most parents, caregivers are like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
or they're just like, sorry, I tried.
Or sorry, they're at their part-time job or whatever it is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, how about I'm a parent and I'm here without my child.
Okay.
Whose name is Francis.
Francis.
Yep. I've never taught a Francis. FYI.
I've taught a Francis.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, I'm Francis's mum.
All right. Let's start the role play. Hi, Chloe. Thanks so much for coming. Please take a seat.
Hi. Nice to meet you. You're Francis's
science teacher. Yes. Yeah. So I'm Miss Tran.
Oh, hi.
I was just
Elizabeth,
thinking.
Is it?
I was thinking how long it's been since I've said Miss Tran. Yes, Elizabeth.
FYI for everyone, Bez's name is actually Elizabeth.
Yes.
Top secret business. So can you tell me, how's Francis going? I know like it's year 10 science, like Francis doesn't really love science that much.
Is that what Francis told you?
I mean, that's what Francis told me, but I'm like, I don't know. Like, how are they going? Like, what's the reality of class?
Yeah, great question. Look, Francis has settled in really well since the start of this term. In terms of learning habits, bit of the organisation, so just making sure that Francis is bringing the correct equipment that could be worked on. So, for example...
Are they not bringing the correct equipment?
Yeah, so there's just some lessons, for example, where Francis has left his workbook in his locker and he's had to come and grab that. So there's just been a few interruptions, which means that it's slower for Francis to actually start the task.
So he's got it, but he's just not bringing it to class?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to have a chat to him about that. He should be a bit more organised.
Yeah. But in terms of learning dispositions, look, like besides the organisation, Francis is trying really hard in science.
Okay.
So
that actually surprises me a little bit, given that he's telling me he doesn't like science.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, it's great. He's definitely making the effort.
Okay.
He's attempting all the work. I think it was a bit slow to start in that, Francis didn't necessarily always complete a task if he didn't feel confident. But I think we've turned that around now.
I'm interested to hear that it was a bit slow to start for Francis and maybe he was getting a bit distracted. I don't know. But I know at the start of the year he was a little bit concerned because he didn't have a lot of his friends in your science class. With the electives and things running, I think his friends had chosen like other subjects.
Yeah.
So, I'm just a little bit shocked to hear that he wasn't doing the work, because I'm kind of like, well, what else was he doing? Like, was he just not doing it, or like was he chatting to people in the class? Like, what was he getting distracted by?
Look, I'm not sure. I think it may have been his device.
Okay.
It's certainly not chatting with other people. Like,
Yep.
he works quite well and collaboratively with other people as well. I think sometimes he can just get distracted on his device. So,
Okay.
in order to help students manage that, we've done a few activities where they do have to close their laptop, and
Yep.
I've found that that's helpful
Okay.
as well. So, I think that one will come with practice and just reminding him of expectations in class.
Okay. What's he like with homework? Is he doing his homework? He tells me he's doing his homework.
Yes. So he is submitting his homework
Yep.
and a lot more frequently as well. So it's really great to see that he's attempting all of the work.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, with his assessments, like his last assessment, he got 55% on the quiz.
Yep.
So, yeah, I'm just thinking, like, if he's attempting all the work, like, what can we do to sort of help him improve?
So he is doing the work. The next step for Francis is reflecting on his work. So I'd really encourage him, for example, the quizzes and the activities that we do in class. If he's having a look at that feedback and then coming to me asking with clarifying questions if he needs,
Okay.
I think that will help in terms of his next assessments.
Okay, awesome. I might even just quiz him a little bit at home. Is there anything that I could use to help him with that? Is there like you mentioned his workbook? Would that help us? Like, is that what most of the things that you learn in class are assessed on, like the activities in the workbook?
In the workbook, we've also got like online quizzes as well.
Oh, okay.
But it's an expectation when students, before they leave class, that they're writing down what the homework is, and I check that. So a good place to start, if Francis doesn't really remember, is just asking him to have a look in his diary. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good starting
Or just
point.
ask him.
Yeah.
He's year 10. He should be managing this himself. I shouldn't have to check his diary at this
Yeah.
point, right?
Hopefully not. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Elizabeth. That's really good. I think I'll go home and chat to Francis about some of this now. And hopefully we can just improve how he goes on some of his assessments.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. And feel free to contact me. You've got my email. Let me know if you're having any trouble with that. Obviously, it's a partnership, so, happy to think of other strategies or alternatives if that's not really working as well to support him.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
No worries.
All right, cool. So that was a bit of an example for everyone. We kind of went down a little journey, which was funny because you were like, oh my gosh, I don't actually teach a Francis and I don't know who this person is. But I would describe that as kind of like a bit of a mid-range. It's like you've got a mid-range student who's kind of doing most of the things that they should be doing, maybe not completely achieving everything. I actually find that those are some of the most difficult interviews to have.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think so too. And you probably heard me umming and ahhing and figuring out what my next piece of information I was going to say was, because in those situations, there's not necessarily always a clear one specific thing that you want. It might just be homework, or it might be behaviour, like a combination of low-level things that they can improve on. But it's not.
But together they have a cumulative effect.
Yes, but it's not one specific.
Yeah.
Francis is chatting with this person. That's why he's not doing the work.
Yeah. And sometimes, like, I think part of the challenge then is sometimes it goes the other way, and the feedback that you might have is actually so specific that it's hard to articulate to the parent because you might be like, oh, okay, I know that Francis, has trouble with evaluation type questions, and we need to work through this particular scaffold, or there's like a strategy that we're using that I know is effective with them, and I need them to implement it in X, Y, Z, Y.
Yep.
But communicating that to a parent who doesn't understand the, art and science of teaching and why we do things the way we do can be quite challenging.
Yes.
It's a tricky situation.
It is, yeah. I also found I'm sure you're the same as well.
Yeah.
But over time with parent-teacher interviews, it's helpful having the student there in that obviously there are things that you want to discuss and talk about moving forward. But I found it so powerful asking the student themselves, how do you think you're going?
Yeah.
And, if they're like, great.
Yeah.
You can be like, okay, how did you find the
Why do you
last
think it's
assessment?
great? Yeah,
or how are
prompt
you
them.
how are you finding the class discussion? Sort of ask guiding questions.
Yeah. And you often find out more that way, right?
They do. And they're very honest
Yeah.
as well in their reflections.
Sometimes they're
And
really different in front of their parents. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is not the student that I teach.
yeah.
If in that situation, if we go back to this example of Frances that we've just given, what are some questions that you would have asked Frances if they were there?
My always opening question is how are you finding this class, Frances? And then depending on, it always depends on the answers you get, but you can ask, how are you finding this class? How do you think you're going? How are you finding the workload as well? How are you finding the content? You can ask about their last assessment. How did you feel about that last assessment?
Yep.
What things were difficult?
What do you think that you're doing well?
Yeah.
What do you think that we could
improve on? Yeah. But students will be very honest.
Yeah.
When you ask them
And I
those
think
questions.
in the case of Frances, like we've heard from Mum, we've heard that, Frances says they don't really love science or they're not very good at science. So that's a really good opportunity to be like, oh, I'm really surprised to hear that.
Yes.
Why do you say that? Like, I'm kind of shocked to hear that. And then you might find out more, like maybe they're not feeling confident, but that hasn't been blatantly obvious to you. Or maybe they're actually feeling a little bit self-conscious that they got 55% on their last quiz and they thought they did better.
Yeah.
And that sort of comes out in a discussion, in which case you can have a conversation around, okay, well, what did you do to prepare for that quiz? Can you talk me through your study habits? Okay, here's some things that we could try for next time. Did you use these, I don't know what it was that you referred to in our mock interview, but did you refer to this specific resource? Did you put your homework in the diary? Did you forget about it? Like what's going on?
Yeah.
That really helps to pinpoint things. I also want to jump now back to this idea of like a difficult interview. And I kind of want to group them into different types of difficult interviews that you could come across.
Yes.
And maybe you can discuss like how we could approach them.
Yes, I think that is great.
What are some common types of difficult interviews that you have had?
At my first school, a really common one was unrealistic expectations of the student.
Okay, like high expectations?
Very high expectations, and then also just a mismatch between what the parent or caregiver thought the student was completing or achieving versus what
The
was
reality?
actually,
Like
happening
they
in the
thought they
classroom.
were achieving more or less or?
More.
Okay. So how did you tackle that? How do you deal with that kind of conversation and how does that come out?
So in terms of managing those conversations, obviously some conversations you have to handle quite
Delicately?
gently
Yeah.
and delicately. But in those situations, that's where I found, for example, pulling up the learning management system or having evidence of work.
You need it.
That is the most helpful because otherwise it's he said, she said.
And then you can go, well, actually, here's an example of da-da-da, and this is the kind of thing I'm speaking to.
So in those situations, for example, I would open up the learning management system and be like, okay, so as you can see here, over the last term,
here's the number of times that Thingo has been late to class.
Yeah, and, of the 5 homework tasks that I've set, only 1 has been submitted. I've actually got one here. As you can see, they started off on the first 2 questions and then have just left the rest blank.
Yep.
Have they had a conversation with you about how they're finding this subject? And
go from there.
Yeah,
I think having evidence is so important.
Yes.
And also, I think the other thing that we often forget is that by the time you come around to parent-teacher interviews, like mostly they're sort of either towards the end of term 1 or sort of beginning to mid-term 2. you don't want that to be the first time that a parent is hearing
Yes.
about something.
That is an excellent point, Chloe.
Yeah, like at that point, they should already be aware of most things that are happening in class. Like we should be liaising with them prior to that.
Yeah.
Often things can blow up if it is the first time that
Yes.
they're hearing about things. But it's interesting that you mentioned high expectations because, you know, I worked in schools where I did have a bunch of parents who were not English speaking but had very high expectations of their students. And so, you know, to me it was a very minor thing, but it was something worth mentioning. Something like, you know, sometimes they're getting a bit distracted in class by their friends and then I have to remind them to get back on task. So just, you know, remembering that, you know, XYZ times for talking and play or whatever it is. Just those little reminders. But mentioning that to the parent was like a massively big deal for them.
Yes.
And then often, and this could happen to you, the parent would then turn to the student and start telling them off.
Yeah.
And like, I don't understand Vietnamese. I know you do. So you'd be like, oh, no.
I would join in. No, joking.
They, you know, I could tell that like they were being told off by their parent. You know, sometimes it happens when it's English speaking, they start telling them off in front of you and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really awkward. What do I do?
Yeah.
So sometimes you actually have to temper the emotions of the parents.
Yes.
And just because you don't want it to turn into a situation where the student is then all of a sudden being punished at home for something that is actually quite minor in your classroom.
Yes. Yep.
Like you want the consequences to match the behaviours. And if the behaviour is not a massive issue, then there shouldn't be a massive punishment going on. So sometimes you have to negotiate that with families and just sort of temper them, be like, look, this isn't actually happening all of the time.
Yeah.
However, it's just a bit of a reminder.
Yeah.
And then sometimes parents will be like, oh, there needs to be a seating plan. They shouldn't be allowed to sit with their friends. In which case, like, you just need to be assertive with that parent.
Yes.
And just be like, yep, you know, we actually do have a seating plan in place and these are the types of things. Get some input from the student. Who are some people in the class that you think you work well with? Okay, let's implement something like that.
Yeah.
Or, well, actually, no, we don't utilise a seating plan because of XYZ. You know, maybe it's a senior class and you don't want to be doing that for whatever reason because they need to work with others. But you're tempering parents' behaviours, I think is harder than tempering the kids.
Yeah, for sure.
Tempering students is like easy. They're never going to come at you really mad in an interview. Or look, can't say that's never happened to anyone ever.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened to me. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult one as well. But speaking of seating plans, there's quite a few conversations I had actually with students and parents and caregivers where, you know, students were distracted in class and I'd ask them to move and whatnot. It's helpful to have that conversation again with students and parents and caregivers and then being like, look, you know, I can be strategic about this and say that I've moved you, but who do you think you would actually work well with in this class? Give me 2 names. And then you can sort of take the what's the word for it? You can take the pressure off the student of having to turn to their friends and being like, I can't sit with you in this class because I don't work. Sometimes it's difficult for them to do. They do need to learn it eventually. But to help them there, you can be like, be honest with me.
That's
who do you work well with?
Important too, because like you said, that's not a discussion they're going to have with you at school.
No.
When their friends are around.
No, absolutely
so
not.
you can have some of these really important discussions when it's like, it's just us here. It's us and, you know, mum and dad or grandma or whoever it is. Like, let's be honest. And they'll tell you. They'll be like, oh, actually, I don't work the best with my best mate. Or, you know, I don't like working with this person because, you know, they don't pull their weight sometimes or this person dominates conversation. I find it really challenging. In which case, you know, if that's a natural pairing that you usually go for because you're like, oh, they work so great together. But in the kids' eyes, they don't and they're getting frustrated. Like, it just helps manage those relationships, doesn't it? And
it does.
But you get a better classroom dynamic because of it.
You really do. Yeah.
Lastly, this hasn't happened to me. I'm just going to preface that. But I'm curious to know if you have any stories on this because I have a story, but it's not from me. It's from another teacher. have you witnessed or have you personally experienced any situations where parents have perhaps become either aggressive towards you or passive aggressive, or maybe even they've taken the student's side? So maybe the student's saying something that's not quite true, and then the parents or the guardians are siding with them, and you're having to deal with the situation like that.
I personally haven't experienced that, thankfully.
Yep.
There was an incident where one of my co-workers actually, on the night of parent-teacher interviews, where I can't remember the context of it, but at one point the parent had stood up and was pointing and yelling
Oh, goodness.
at this teacher.
Okay.
I can't remember. It would have been my very early years of teaching. But schools should have set up a system
Yep.
or the setting in a way where if those incidents do happen, someone from leadership is able to step in
Yep.
and de-escalate that situation as well.
Yep.
And they're helpful questions to ask, if it's your first few parent-teacher interviews, or if you're feeling a bit nervous about a particular parent,
Yep.
just wording up the teacher. The
Can you
teacher's
please
next
be
to
around
you.
at this time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like I've had a teacher who was like, hey, this is going to be a difficult conversation. If it gets to this point or if this starts happening, can you just step in?
Yep.
Yeah. So schools should have a system, a support system there where if that does happen, someone is able to step in, and leadership is also able to step in
100%.
and de-escalate that.
Yep.
But in that situation, I've had with wellbeing meetings where that's happened, but in those situations, it's obviously not helpful and it's a boundary is being crossed.
Yeah.
Being able to calmly say, I understand you're frustrated right now, but we can't have this conversation if you continue to shout. We can continue it
Once you've
yeah,
calmed down.
once
Or
you've
I
calmed-
don't think that this conversation is productive.
Yep.
And I think we should resume it at a
Yes.
different time.
Yeah. And then if they continue to do that, then you can say, if you continue to raise your voice, unfortunately, I'm going to have to step out of the room.
Yep.
And you can contact me when you're ready to have a conversation about it.
Yep.
So I think that's when the if-then, then I will do that. It's
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah, the if-then statement is so good.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, look, again, I haven't experienced anything where things completely blew up, or I've just dealt with parents who've been upset that I've gone over time. It's a very small issue, but yeah, I have had situations where a staff member was feeling really nervous about both the student and their family members coming to visit them because of some previous issues with the student and the fact that the family had felt like this student was being treated unfairly by this teacher, even though that wasn't the case. And anyway, it was just a full situation that everyone knew about. And so, as you said before, this teacher actually asked a member of the leadership team to make sure that they were around at the time of this interview and to perhaps join the interview with them to act as a mediator.
Yeah.
But also they didn't feel safe. And I think we need to remember that, whilst in our professions as teachers, we are very people-pleasing, we can be very empathetic, it's also our job, but we also have a right to be safe and to feel safe at our place of work. And so you never should be forced into a situation where you feel uncomfortable. And yeah, I think that's when you said before, making sure you've got those systems and procedures in place to make sure that you do feel okay and you can step away from conversation.
Yeah.
And, if you're being threatened, that's not okay.
Yeah. And even having, because if you're anything like me, once I'm flustered, I'll blank out.
Yeah.
So one of my co-workers actually gave me this tip, writing on a Post-it note that statement itself, so that in that situation you can just have a look at the Post-it note, read it, because in those moments, your mind can blank and you can get flustered because you've got so much adrenaline going through you, being like, oh my gosh, is this happening? To finish off, we've talked a lot about difficult conversations and, unrealistic expectations. Parent-teacher interviews, they are also a really great opportunity to, build stronger partnerships and relationships. And, from my experience, most of the time they have been really pleasant and also really reaffirming to the work that you do as a teacher and the contributions you make as well.
100%.
So don't let us put you off.
No, I
parent-teacher
think we do.
interviews.
Yeah. I think we need to finish on a high. Like the vast majority of your parent-teacher interviews will be really great, productive conversations. And it'll actually be a really great experience for you to meet these families, and you will notice a difference in students' behaviour if it's addressed in those interviews as well.
Yes.
And it's also like students actually really like introducing you to their parents and guardians and like, sometimes you teach multiple siblings and it becomes a thing, and then the siblings come along and you're like, how have you been? Like, it's really lovely. It builds a sense of community and, then you recognise each other in public spaces. I think, I actually really enjoyed them.
Yeah.
As tiring as they were and as dead as I was afterwards, yes, I so enjoyed them. Before we finish up today, Bez,
Yes.
what would your top tip for managing your energy at parent-teacher interviews, what would that be?
Excellent question. Get a good night's sleep the day before and the day after.
Well, she's holding up fingers, everyone, so she's definitely giving me more than one.
Did you say 3? You said 3, didn't you?
Oh, give me 3. I'm good with 3.
That's why I'm counting. The second thing, make sure you've got a bottle of water next to you or a glass of water, because you do a lot of talking. And I think quite early on when you do parent-teacher interviews, the first few times you'll notice that your voice, you'll know that you talked too loud or too much if you lose your voice the next day.
Yep.
And then the third thing is, I would just say take it easy for that week in terms of your social calendar or what you've booked in outside of work. As exciting as it is all those weeks before when you're planning things, might even be helpful just to block out in your calendar unavailable, so that if anyone's asking you anything, you can just be like, sorry, I'm out that week, I can't do it.
Yep.
Because like you said, it is very energy.
It's a big day or a big couple of days.
What about yours? What's your 3?
Yep.
Tips?
Mine would be don't run over into your dinner or lunch break. I used to always do that, and then I used to not have a long enough break. So make sure you take that break. Have both a ginormous bottle of water and some, like a cup of tea or like some lozenges or something with you to help soothe your throat, because like you said, you do get a very dry mouth with all the talking and a very sore throat you will notice by the next day. And I would say, like, when you get home, just like make sure you give yourself at least an hour just to decompress, because I don't know, I always felt like my brain was always sort of like whizzing with all of the information, all of the different conversations that I'd had.
Yeah.
So just making sure like you can kind of debrief and then decompress.
Yeah.
And just like wind down so that you can actually sleep properly that night. That's kind of, that's my top 3.
They're great tips.
Yay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you've had your interviews, I hope you had a good experience. If they're coming up soon, hopefully these tips were helpful to you. If you enjoyed listening to our podcast today or any other day, please let us know by rating us on Apple or Spotify. You're listening to Two Friends Who Teach. I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez. Catch you next time.
Bye.